I'm Martin Lewis, co-creator of the Secret Policeman's Ball series and one of the producers of the first 4 Amnesty Balls. Amnesty International was formed back in 1961 in Britain, and for the first 15 years of its existence it had a comparatively low profile. And in 1976, as they were coming up for a 15th anniversary, the folks running the British section of Amnesty contacted John Cleese of Monty Python. They were looking for a way to raise their profile and raise some much needed money. John Cleese reacted very positively and offered to put on a benefit show. Now, back in the mid-70s in Britain, a benefit show usually took place on a Sunday evening somewhere in a theatre, was over by 10 o'clock, and usually featured just middle-of-the-road entertainers. John came up with some crucial differences that made a real splash and made really the beginnings of the Secret Policeman's Ball, which came into fruition 3 years later in '79. What John did was this. First of all, he said, why do one night? Let's do 3 nights. Much more fun, raise more money. Secondly, instead of doing it at a polite early evening, let's do it late night. There's a different atmosphere late night, not least because the British pubs have been open till 11 o'clock at night, and these shows started at 11:30, and the audience and some of the cast were suitably liberated and certainly hydrated. And there was a great atmosphere. And crucially, John also offered to round up some of his friends. Now, his friends happened to be Monty Python, Beyond the Fringe, the great British comedy troupe from the 60s, and also some of the other leading lights of that 60s and 70s generation of British comedians. Armed with all those people, the show was going to be really special. The person at Amnesty who was really driving was a guy called Peter Luff, who was the assistant director. And he was really gung-ho in gathering together all the elements. I got involved because I heard about the show, and I was working at a record company at the time, and I volunteered my services to produce a cast album that they could sell and make some money with. But it was such an all-hands-on-deck atmosphere that anybody who was lending a hand got roped in to do other things. So my background was publicity and marketing, so I did publicity and marketing for the show and soon started helping Peter as one of the producers. There was such a great atmosphere backstage at those shows. First of all, they took place, the first night was actually on April Fool's, so already you're off to a great start. And there was also something interesting. Not all of the folks in Monty Python were in town. Practically all of them except Eric Idle was out of town. So a tradition came up that if somebody wasn't there, somebody else would step in for him. Peter Cook from Beyond the Fringe stepped in and became an honorary Python. Ditto, Dudley Moore, who's a member of Beyond the Fringe, he was in LA at the time, so Terry Jones of Monty Python stepped in and became an honorary Beyond the Fringer. This was actually a hallmark of what later happened in the Secret Policeman's Ball shows starting in '79. The atmosphere, as I said, late night was great. There was no backstage bar, there was no green room groupies hanging out, just a very cramped dressing rooms. As you'll see, a really great camaraderie amongst all these fellow performers, some of whom hadn't seen each other perform for many years. Peter Luff, who I mentioned, in fact, there's a little bit of footage of Peter Luff and myself. I'm the one on the left with the clipboard, the clip-on bow tie and the badly clipped hair. Amnesty International was very fortunate that as it was preparing to make the show, they were approached by a top documentary maker called Roger Grafe, and he volunteered to document the show, the preparations, the rehearsals, and that's how the film Pleasure to Majestys came about. Originally, the stage show was titled by John Cleese, A Poke in the Eye with a Sharp Stick. But in Britain, there's a colloquial expression for somebody who is in prison, detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. And since this show took place at Her Majesty's Theatre, Roger came up with the title Pleasure at Her Majesty's. I'll be back after the film with an after-the-ball commentary, but first, let's enjoy Pleasure at Her Majesty's. It's better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. Hello, I'm Martin Lewis, co-creator of the Secret Policeman's Ball series and one of the producers of the first 4 balls. And it's my pleasure to be offering you this little audio commentary on Pleasure to Majestys. Now, here we are at the beginning of the show. This took place in 1976. In fact, in April of 1976. April 1st, 2nd and 3rd were the 3 nights of the show, and we're actually at viewing a little part where we had some of the performers posing for the noted British paparazzi and British media. The lady on the left happens to be Jane Walmsley of Capital Radio. I remember this because one of my jobs at that time was doing the publicity and marketing for the show, and Jane Walmsley, an American lady living in London, is interviewing Peter Cook and various other members of the cast backstage. There was quite a media sensation when this show was announced in Britain, perhaps because it was so unusual to have all these comedians of this generation of British performers who came to light really in the 60s and 70s. This was billed, I remember doing the publicity for this, where we described this as the British equivalent of the Concert for Bangladesh in comedy. Remember the Concert for Bangladesh that George Harrison organised in 1971 in New York City, gathered together the leading rock performers of the day, and here we were gathering the top British comedians of the day, and there'd been nothing like this in Britain before, so the media came out in force to have a look at this extravaganza as it was in preparation. And on the Sunday morning before the show started, I say, it was 3 consecutive nights, Thursday, Friday and Saturday night. And on the Sunday before, which memory serves was 28th of March 1976, all the performers came together for the first and only time at the theatre where the event was to take place. And here you see them all milling around outside. We grabbed them from the rehearsal and asked them to come out on the street. We managed to get quite a few of the British photographers from the various national newspapers, and so the performers actually gathered the street. Now normally when you have celebrities around to pose for a photograph, you have maybe 2 or 3 celebrities. We had such a plethora that the photographers didn't know how to pose them. They actually made them stand up rather like a soccer team. So you've got them crouched down because there were something like 30 performers, as you can see, and in the end Jonathan Miller from Beyond the Fringe decides, would it help if we walked backwards? Then you could get us into your camera screens, and that's why they're walking backwards. The narration you hear at this point, incidentally, is from the member of Beyond the Fringe, Dudley Moore, and he was the one of the 4 members of Beyond the Fringe who couldn't be at the show. He was actually in Los Angeles at the time, so he got involved as the narrator, and we were able to ask him to do that. In a few moments you'll see one of the key people from Amnesty International who put the show together, who was the assistant director, a chap called Peter Luff, and he really was the powerhouse to making this show happen. And you'll see Peter in a few moments. There's Jonathan Miller, who was the director of the stage show. There's Peter Luff in your screen, and the chap with him on the immediate left wearing a very bad bow tie is me, aged about 12 I think. Here are the performers going back into the rehearsal. We took maybe about 15 minutes out on that Sunday morning to do the photographs. Now, this is Alan Bennett, one of the founder members of Beyond the Fringe. He's preparing his piece that he's going to do at the show, and there's the members of the cast just sitting, enjoying the show. And in fact, this was the only time that the cast members got to see each other, and one of the reasons why they all wanted to do it was so they could get a chance to see some of their favourite performers. There you see Michael Palin and Graham Chapman of Monty Python seeing Alan Bennett on stage. They hadn't seen him on stage for 15 years because Alan had become a writer in the interim, so it was the joy of seeing Alan Bennett. He incidentally went on to write great movies like the killing of the madness of King George. And Jonathan Miller, one of the other members of Beyond the Fringe, was by now an established stage director, directed a lot of opera and plays, so he was the natural person to be the director of the stage show. John Cleese was the person who gathered all the performers together, but it was Jonathan Miller who became the stage director. This is one of the greats of the British comedy world who emerged in the 60s at the same time as Beyond the Fringe. This is John Bird, who became very famous in Britain for his impersonations of British Prime Ministers such as Harold Wilson, well, slightly famous to us Beatle fans because Harold Wilson was the one who gave the member of the British Empire, the MBE, to the Beatles. And John Bird was known for doing performances like that, also for doing a wonderful impersonation of Idi Amin, known as the last king of Scotland to recent movie fans.
Because John hasn't written the sketch.
No, okay.
But I'll give you one afterwards. All right, yeah, none to be had, none to be had, that's all.
A number of amusing, tasteless remarks.
John Bird is causing a little bit of consternation to the director because he's going to do a piece, but he hasn't actually written it yet. So a little contretemps in the theatre as they're trying to work out what to do, only to find that John simply says, well, I'll sit here and I'll write it, but I haven't written it yet. Peter Cook. Of course, Peter Cook was one of the quartet in Beyond the Fringe with Dudley Moore, Jonathan Miller and Alan Bennett. So here's Jonathan having the pleasure of directing one of his old comrades. Now, in the intervening 16, 17 years since Beyond the Fringe was a huge hit, first in London and then in New York on Broadway, Peter Cook has become famous as a partner with Dudley Moore, great comedy double act. Again, here you see John Cleese and all the performers just having a huge giggle at the fun going on. Barry Humphries, some of you may know Barry Humphries, Dame Edna Everage. Now, in 1976, Dame Edna had not really cracked the American market, but Barry Humphries, in his regular garb, not in the distinctive dress that is the hallmark of Dame Edna Everage, here Barry Humphries is just arriving, and he's late at the rehearsals. All the other people have been out there, and Barry's getting such a kick of seeing friends he hasn't seen for 14 or 15 years. Now we're at something really rare. This is a rehearsal of the Monty Python team working on a skit that they're going to do live on stage. What's interesting, this is the courtroom sketch. That was a skit that appeared in their TV show, Monty Python's Flying Circus, but they hadn't really performed it on stage, maybe once or twice, but not for a very long time. Now, it was fortuitous that Amnesty International and John Cleese got together in the spring of 1976 because the Pythons were planning to go to New York to make their Broadway debut. So the idea of performing together at the Amnesty International show actually suited Monty Python very well because, in a sense, they could warm up and do some preparation for that New York debut. So here they are having a first run-through of the courtroom sketch and envisioning it how it would be on stage as distinct from TV. And they're going through the material and they're noting some of the lines, and here you'll see Terry Jones, for example, who, looking at it, they've got this script very organised, and he knows that some of the jokes might not work in the same way to a stage audience as they did to a television audience. So this fascinating little discussion between the Pythons about how they could perhaps improve the skit. Now, the only member of Monty Python who wasn't available, alas, was Eric Idle. Eric was out of town at the time. So when you see the performance in the actual film from the show later on, you will see that the part that Eric Idle had taken in the original TV show was being played by Peter Cook of Beyond the Fringe. And this actually grew to become a hallmark of the Amnesty International shows. If somebody wasn't there, then somebody would substitute. In fact, Terry Jones of Monty Python substituted for Dudley Moore in a Beyond the Fringe sketch in this very show. They're having such pleasure reliving this skit. I think the skit was done for television in '71, so it's now 5 years later, and they're having quite a giggle as they reminisce and try to imagine how they can improve upon it. Now, John Cleese had first got involved with Amnesty International. He was aware of its work. Amnesty International was formed in Britain in 1961, basically to promote human rights. And at that time, it was a little-known organisation, and John became quite involved. Oh, I love this moment. This is where Michael Palin is remembering some little dance steps they'd had for their song called Anything Goes. No relation to the Cole Porter song. And look at the joy and merriment of them, and they're doing this. They can't even remember it, but suddenly it's coming back to them, and Cleese watching the others to see what the dance steps should be. And still not necessarily getting it quite right, but by the night it's there. Now, while the Pythons are rehearsing, some friends of theirs are rehearsing in another home, and this is Bill Oddie's house in Hampstead, northwest London. This is a group known in Britain as the Goodies, and they were a sort of junior Python, if you like, a little more aimed at a younger crowd, a little bit more obvious humour, more visual humour, and a lot of songs. Now, some of these folks actually had a history with John Cleese. The two folks on the left, Bill Oddie Lee is the songwriter in the group, and Tim Brooke Taylor, the chap in the middle. They were both with John Cleese in a very seminal radio show in the 1960s, early 60s, called I'm Sorry, I'll Read That Again. And that was where John Cleese first came to prominence in Britain. So these guys are all old friends together. And the links that led to Monty Python are further strengthened by the chap we're seeing now, Tim Brooke Taylor, the chap in the red sweater, was also with John Cleese and Graham Chapman and Marty Feldman in a seminal BBC television show that led to Monty Python called At Last the 1948 Show. That show was very popular in Britain in 66 and 67. Monty Python formed in 1969. So you're seeing, this is one of the reasons why the show was so exciting for all the performers, because old groups and friends and friendly rivals were gathering together. The Goodies, by now, who've got a popular television show in Britain, have had a hit record recently with a song, a kind of tongue-in-cheek song called Funky Gibbon. I guess it's the British equivalent of doing the disco duck, i.e. it's not considered as one of the hallmarks, one of the greatest achievements in popular music of all time. It's a fun novelty song. And the Goodies have never performed it live on stage. And they're actually kvetching slightly in a humorous way because they know that the Pythons have been in rehearsal to go on Broadway. And whereas these guys are going to go on stage and haven't done any live performances ever. They've only ever done TV shows as a unit. So they're comparing notes about it. And when you watch the film again without my commentary going, you'll hear that Tim Brooke Taylor on the right is talking very excitedly about the joy of being able to see Alan Bennett do one of his solo pieces. And this, again, as I mentioned earlier, is what was so important to them, because as these performers grew up in the late 50s and 60s, they had favourites among some of the other performers, and that's one of the reasons why they wanted to see the show. Now we're at the home of Jonathan Miller, the chap in the light blue shirt, one of the four members of Beyond the Fringe, and they're going through a skit that they're going to do together. But as I mentioned, Dudley Moore is not there, so three of the quartet are there. That's Jonathan Miller's son. There's Jonathan Miller, Alan Bennett and Peter Cook, but no Dudley Moore, so Terry Jones of Monty Python has volunteered to step in for Dudley. And here they're going through, the skit is quite well known from Beyond the Fringe. It was called So That's the Way You Like It, a spoof on Shakespeare's As You Like It. And it was one of the big hits of the Beyond the Fringe show. Beyond the Fringe started as a gathering of comedians. They were comedians, they weren't even comedians really, they were university students who liked doing comedy. And they did this just for fun in the evenings. And the two best comedians from Oxford University and from Cambridge University were put together literally like an arranged marriage. Somebody thought, well, why don't we get the two funniest chaps out of Oxford University and the two funniest out of Cambridge, kind of the equivalent of saying Yale and Harvard, and put them together at a festival and see if they can come up with something together. And that's really the arranged marriage that led to Beyond the Fringe, and it went to the Edinburgh Festival in 1959. It was such an immediate hit, it transferred shortly afterwards to London's West End, and unbelievably it then transferred to Broadway in New York. This was unheard of for young British performers who were barely in their early 20s to be a big hit on Broadway. Terry Jones doing a very passable impersonation or impression of Dudley Moore, including that falsetto singing voice. Those of you who are Dudley Moore fans know that he can always get into that. Fascinating conversation, which when you review this film without the commentary you'll enjoy, is when Alan Bennett, in the centre with the glasses, starts talking with Terry Jones about the joys of performing or otherwise. And one of the things that Alan Bennett mentions was that these guys in Beyond the Fringe had not actually performed together since about, I think, 1963 or 64. So it's now 12 years has elapsed. And Alan is saying, I could never do this again with these guys, and how much he envies the Pythons. And of course, Terry Jones is kind of surprised because the Pythons are still in their comparative infancy. They've only been going 6 or 7 years at that point, and they've been very happily doing TV shows and stage shows and record albums, and they're about to do they've just done a film, they're about to do more work, and they're looking at each other. But Alan Bennett says, well, how can you work with each other? I could never work with Jonathan again, I could never work with Peter Cook or Dudley Moore again. And Alan Bennett at one point rather plaintively offers, well, look, if you need an extra, I'd be very happy to join Monty Python. Alan Bennett, of course, really did become a huge success in Britain as a playwright, a writer of stage plays, television plays, and feature films. I mentioned The Madness of King George. He also wrote the wonderful film called Prick Up Your Ears about the death of the playwright Joe Orton. He's quite a distinguished and very revered figure in British comedy and as a writer, but people still have a great affection for him as a performer. And Terry Jones, I've been friends with Terry for years. I once asked him about this, and he said, how could he turn down a chance to work with Alan Bennett and Jonathan Miller and Peter Cook? This was such a special thing for him to be a part of Beyond the Fringe. Even though the difference in age between them was probably maybe about 5 or 6 years, but when you're in your late teens and early 20s, 5 or 6 years is quite a considerable gap. So Terry Jones and all the other Pythons looked up to Beyond the Fringe as the performers that paved the way for them. Without Beyond the Fringe, there would not have been a Monty Python, certainly as we know it, because the impact of Beyond the Fringe was so considerable in terms of, it was described at that time as satire, though the members of Beyond the Fringe don't regard it as satire so much as absurdist humour. They were mocking the pomposity of British life in post-war, after the Second World War. There was a lot of stiffness, and it was the British equivalent of the grey Eisenhower years. The British 50s was very dull, and along came Beyond the Fringe, and in a sense, rather like another quartet that came along a couple of years later, the Beatles. Beyond the Fringe did for comedy what the Beatles did for music. Now here they are back at the rehearsal at the theatre. This is Her Majesty's Theatre at the Haymarket, right near Piccadilly Circus for those who've ever visited London, and they're rehearsing on stage the Lumberjack song. There's John Cleese having a very rare cigarette. You do not normally see John smoking, but on occasion. Now Jonathan Miller here, wearing his director's hat, comes up with an interesting idea. He's watching how they're doing the Lumberjack song, and the various performers are going to join and become honorary lumberjacks, honorary pythons if you like, and Jonathan's got an interesting idea that at the end maybe they should wander off as though they're at a theological or philosophical discussion of lumberjacks. So don't just walk off as though you're discussing lumberjacks. And look at Michael Palin, fascinated to get this read, because they've not come up with that idea themselves. So again, it's a cross-generational thing. Jonathan Miller's come up with a great way to end the skit. Oh, that's different. Let's try it. Very much that spirit of camaraderie. So now they're going to continue working on it. Terry Gilliam in the check shirt. By the way, of course, Terry Gilliam, the one American in Monty Python, was not so much a performer on the television shows. He focused primarily on doing the animations. But when it came to the stage shows, Terry Gilliam really enjoyed getting into it. There we are. Various philosophical interpretations of what it means to be a lumberjack. Of course, lurking into the shot is Peter Cook, just wondering if he could do, and sharing a great moment. He's talking about working with one of the other performers, John Fortune, and you'll hear, when you hear this, he talks about the drunken reminiscence about working with Lenny Bruce in the 60s. Peter Cook was such a hero to these folks because after Beyond the Fringe, he opened up a club in London, which is, I guess, the equivalent in Britain of things like the Comedy Store in America, in New York, or Catch a Rising Star in New York. It was in early 60s. It was called The Establishment, and it was the hip late night comedy club in Britain in the early 60s. Lenny Bruce made his only British appearances there, and Peter Cook was reminiscing there about having to pick up Lenny Bruce at the airport. And again, it's very important. We managed to find some props in the theatre. I can't remember what show was taking place in that theatre at the time, but we found some pics. Maybe it was a Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, I don't know. We found some pics, and the photographers were always looking for some prop to make it work. So that's now they're back inside, and they're working on the Shakespeare sketch. Now you will find this is why Beyond the Fringe broke up in the end. Look at Alan Bennett. Alan Bennett's having some serious doubts. Jonathan said, "Oh, don't worry, we'll sort this out." And Alan is very stressed. "Oh no, we've got to have the script. Where's this?" And Peter and Jonathan are full of mirth because they're used to Alan being such a perfectionist, and they tend to go more by the seat of their pants. But it's wonderful to see Alan like that, and being Alan is such a joy, but he is a perfectionist, and the personalities within the four members. Look at Jonathan's just full of laughter. He said, "Oh, don't worry, it'll sort itself out." But Alan said, "Well, but how?" But the affection. I remember when it was Peter Cook's memorial. Peter Cook died, I think, sadly in 95, 96. The best stories about Peter at his memorial service in London came from Jonathan and Alan and Dudley. The love they all held for each other. There was little family squabbles, and it's like members of the Beatles squabble, the members of Monty Python squabble, all family squabble, but the love and affection within Beyond the Fringe, particularly for Peter Cook, a very cherished figure. Yes, so there was a stage play. This is Her Majesty's Theatre. It was one of the West End theatres, very much like a Broadway theatre, and there was a show. It was John Cleese's idea to do the show in a theatre, but late at night. Up until this particular stage show, the vast majority of charity events in England were all very polite, middle-class events, and all done usually on a Sunday night when there was the theatre would be empty, and they start at 7 o'clock in the evening, be over by 9:30 or 10 o'clock. All British people have to be in bed by 11. It's a law, and be very polite. There wouldn't be any filming, there wouldn't be any recording. It just very middle of the road. John Cleese came up with such a better idea for this show. He said, "Let's do it late at night. Different atmosphere," and he was absolutely right. The audience was vibrant. It was raucous. It was 11:30 at night, and they possibly imbibed an alcoholic tincture or libation. Some of the performers had too, but that atmosphere, as you'll hear when we get to the actual show, is what made the show so special. So what we did was we hunted around to find a theatre that had a show on where the scenery was not so crucial to the show, so that they could actually allow us to come in. I think I still can't remember the name of the show that was on there, other than it had some ice picks in it, or miners' picks. But the show was over by, I think, 10:30. We had to clear the theatre out very quickly. All the performers came in, and we started 11:30. The audience came in, and what was also special, I remember on paper the show was supposed to be over after about, I think, 2.5 hours was the running order, and I knew this because I'd had to order the audio tape for recording the show, and we only managed it because we had some extra tape in the van. It was supposed to be 2.5 hours. It turned out to be about 4 hours because everybody was having such a great time. Now, this is Jonathan Miller is going to visit. That's Barry Humphries dressed up as Dame Edna Everage, housewife superstar. This is the first time that Barry Humphries had done the Dame Edna show as a West End show. He'd been doing it as a cabaret turn, and on TV, but this was the first time in the West End. And Jonathan is going on to visit Barry in his dressing room immediately after the show to discuss what's going to be done. There's been a lightning costume change there. Barry's just got out of his rather nice frock. They're old friends also. Barry Humphries, though Australian, had come to London. There's been a lot of Australians came to London in the late 50s, early 60s, and Barry was in London as early as 1961-62 and started to make a splash on the British comedy scene, and that's where he became friendly with Jonathan Miller, Peter Cook, Dudley Moore and all the others. He's now choosing what dress he'd like to wear as Dame Edna. The Dame Edna character really had its origins in the mid-60s. Barry first introduced the character to British audiences in the mid-60s, and it evolved over the years. At first time it was just literally a suburban housewife, Edna Everage, and then Barry came up with a really great idea of turning her into an outrageous character who would be a housewife superstar. By the way, that is the Dame Edna's pianist and accompanist, and Barry has just remembered that he's forgotten to let Iris. He's forgotten to mention to Iris that he's going to be doing a benefit show for 3 nights and that she's going to be part of it. So Barry is actually breaking the news to Iris on camera, and she takes it very well. So by 1976, the Dame Edna housewife superstar had become a really beloved character in Britain. Hence, Barry was able to be on in the West End doing the show. And it's really a joke that I was agreeably surprised that it became so successful in America, because Dame Edna was very much a joke about how the Australian, the kind of Australian characters characters were laughed at by the British and vice versa. So I thought it was very much in the same way that there's a kind of humour that goes on between Americans and Canadians, there was very much a humour between Britain and Australia. But of course, when it came to it, Dame Edna became quite a cult success in America. So having established what Barry Humphries as Dame Edna is going to do at the show, it doesn't take them long to start reminiscing. And I remember it comes down to a part here where they start to compare notes about who's the oldest among all the performers. They're happy to discover that there is somebody even older than they. Of course, they think they're old. They're in their early 40s, but it must have felt old to people who become successful in their early 20s. I think, in fact, I think Jonathan Miller was about 41 at that time. It was considered old. Now, of course, just barely entering their prime. When it comes to the show, I also wanted to mention that I think I mentioned earlier about how Amnesty International had approached John Cleese. Amnesty had started in 1961, and it was a fairly comparatively unknown organisation. I mean, it was doing wonderful work for raising awareness about human rights and various campaigns to release prisoners of conscience around the world, but the broader audience didn't know too much about it. Here you see two of the organisers. This is in the Amnesty office. On the left is Peter Luff, who is the deputy director, and answering the phone, sitting down, is David Simpson, who was the director of Amnesty at the time. And it's the two of them who are the people who initiated and put together the show, Peter taking more of the lead. I worked more closely with Peter than with David, though David was always in very strong support. But Peter Luff was the powerhouse, and here it's the only moment in the film that's a little bit staged, because really as a documentary it's very much verite, but it was decided that since they needed a stuffed parrot for the Dead Parrot sketch, that Peter would go along to Harrods, and just by chance the cameras just happened to be there to pick up the young lady passing over the offending parrot, which will be used. And now we're on the night. This is Thursday, April the 1st, and a little stylistic device here. Some of the behind-the-scenes material during the show is in black and white. Here's Michael Palin wandering into the dressing room and finding it not quite palatial. In fact, we were very cramped dressing rooms, bearing in mind there was a regular show going on for all those 3 nights, so we were crammed into the dressing rooms from a regular show, and there was something like, I think, about 25 or 26 performers, all in one small theatre. So I think there was only about 3 or 4 dressing rooms, to best of my memory. But everybody managed, there was no superstar tantrums, there was no bar backstage. It was really primitive, but everyone had a very, very good time. There was no doubt at all as to what would open the show. The opening of the show had to be perhaps the most famous at that point of the Monty Python sketches, and that was a foregone conclusion. And I think it's John Cleese who always used to say that he was surprised at the audience reaction to the opening line, but the audience by now had known this skit for, I think, 5 or 6 years, and the roar it always got was just what was needed to kick off the show. So that was why there was no hesitation, and I can probably guess what it's going to be. Latecomers arriving. Palin, of course, improvises. Why are these people walking in late? Palin. Here is an audience full of anticipation. They know what's coming next. Perhaps one of the most immortal lines in British comedy.
I wish to register a complaint.
Hear the audience reaction. The audience goes wild. They know what's coming. It doesn't matter. It's amazing with Monty Python. The fact that the audience knows the lines. It's not like you're going to show to hear the lines for the first time. The audience goes to see Monty Python perform live in those days, or shows like Spamalot. They know what's coming, but that doesn't lessen their pleasure. You're reliving it, and the lines are as funny the 15th or 50th time you've heard them as they are the first time. And what's interesting, I spoke to Michael about this, I guess about a year ago, and one of the things that Michael said to me, he said, you know what, of all the times we performed this on stage, the Dead Parrot sketch perhaps was never funnier than at that very first Amnesty show. And that's because of something that was going on between the two performers in particular. Now, bear in mind that they'd done some stage shows. I think Python went out on tour in 72 and maybe in 74, but or 75. They'd certainly been performing on stage. But there is a certain thing that goes on in British comedic performers. They like to break each other up. They like to make each other laugh. And in England, it's known when you, amongst comedic performers, it's known as corpsing. If you start laughing, it's corpsing. Now, there are several points in this where Michael Palin starts laughing. John Cleese barely laughs. Michael Palin he's watching John. Look at this. I mean, John is in such fine form here. And with the audience laughing, Michael can't help himself, and there's one very memorable moment. I love it in the film when where Michael starts laughing and John tries to look, there's nothing to laugh at here, which of course only makes Michael laugh even more. So it's quite a tradition. You'll see this. You see Michael is losing it here. On the TV show, Michael is totally in character, doesn't laugh at all, but it was impossible for the audience not to laugh. You can imagine how difficult it was for Michael Palin as well.
Was due to it being tarred and shagged out following a prolonged squawk.
Oh, he's probably pining for the field.
Pining for the field?
And we'll see it again. Michael is corpsing here. And then John Cleese starts laughing as well. John can't stop laughing. There you go. Cleese loses as well. He's just in. Michael must have bitten his cheeks raw, trying not to laugh. After this, I think I mentioned that the original concept was that this stage show, the first night, on paper, was 2.5 hours. The audience never stopped laughing. The first night it ran for 4 hours, and it actually started a tradition among the Amnesty shows, certainly all the 4 that I was involved in. Peter Cook, who was a wonderful and very astute gambler, Peter would open up a book on how long the show would last, and especially like doing this with some of the newer performers in the new shows each in succeeding years. And everyone would have, and he said, well, how long do you think the show will last? Look, it says 2.5 hours, how long do you think? And people would say, well, maybe 2 3/4 or 3 1/4. Peter was the best gambler. Peter always won. This was cast and crew. We'd all chip in a little bit of money, and Peter always won because he knew that these shows always overrun. Performers don't like to get off stage when people are laughing. I mean, why would you? And the audience never stopped. So it was just a wonderful joy to see Peter Cook take money off everybody. This is just one of the great performances from Cleese. And it comes up memorably in one of the later Amnesty shows. They did a reprise of it. Here we are, John Fortune, another one of in the centre is John Fortune, another member, a leading member of the British comedy performers who emerged in the early 60s. John Fortune is now very popular in British TV. It's had a revival of interest in him. He and John Bird, who made it in the early 60s, now back on British TV. Alan Bennett doing one of his legendary pieces. This is a piece about T.E. Lawrence, better known to most of us as Lawrence of Arabia. This was a piece that he did in the original Beyond the Fringe show, and it was a huge hit then, a little solo monologue. And after that success, Alan Bennett did pursue a career as a performer after Beyond the Fringe for a few years until he became really successful as a playwright. And he did a TV series called On the Margin, and this particular piece, his spoof about Lawrence of Arabia, was a hallmark in that show. I remember that very vividly. And it's funny because though Alan always says, well, look, I'm very diffident, I'd rather just be a writer. He has from time to time shown up in the West End on stage, taking performances, playing various parts in his own shows. He did a show called 40 Years On. That was his first stage play as a solo playwright. Came out in '68, starred Sir John Gielgud, and Alan Bennett was one of the performers. Here you see Jonathan Miller and a friend watching from the wings. There was no room for the performers to watch from the audience. You saw them in the theatre during the rehearsals. They all wanted to, they were crammed. The wings, you couldn't get into the wings because it was crammed with the other performers all watching their pals on stage. That was just a lovely little glimpse of Jonathan enjoying Alan Bennett. In fact, if you see The Madness of King George, you'll see Alan Bennett has a little cameo in there. I wish Alan Bennett would do more performing, because he's still a glorious performer, but he always thinks of himself just as a writer. The T.E. Lawrence piece, certainly one of the classics of British comedy, and he tried to, and that was actually a hallmark of the Amnesty shows, particularly this very first one, that it would be a mixture of, for the first show, it was primarily everyone's favourites. It was like doing a greatest hits concert. Everyone came on and did their most favourite pieces. In subsequent years, it tended to be a mixture of favourites, because people always want their, like the golden oldies, they want the hits. But they also would premiere new works. And Alan Bennett in the 1981 show, Secret Policeman's Other Ball, I remember him premiering a new work he did with John Fortune. That got quite a great reaction. Here's Dame Edna in the dressing room. Dame Edna did not change, decided to come straight from the show down the road in another theatre, and quite a little excitement backstage. Chatting now, that's John Bird dressed up as Idi Amin. That performance didn't make it into the film. When you think about it, there was a total over 3 nights. There was something like 12 hours of comedy, so the film is only 100 minutes long. Not all of it could be in there. Now, that is the delightful Iris, accompanist to Dame Edna. The audience knows what's coming. It's not going to be John Cleese singing. It's Dame Edna. Dame Edna is carrying Australia's national flower, the gladioli. And Dame Edna tended to share these flowers with the audience at certain points. As I say, Barry's Dame Edna character was so beloved by this point, the audience is primed and know what they're going to get. Well, it could have been actually, except they know Dame Edna, but they didn't know exactly what Barry was going to do. Barry had a choice. He could have done one of his monologues, in which or pieces where he interacts with the audience, but he knows that for a late night entertainment, what would be most enjoyable would be a song. And there's a particular song that Barry's going to do called British Spunk, True British Spunk, and making a few comments about how Britain is in rather poor economic straits, which it was in 1976. So Barry's promising the audience that Britain will rise again, say to the level of Algeria or Malta or Cyprus. The British sense of self-deprecation to the fore here. By the way, the stage show was not called Pleasure to Majestys. The show title was A Poke in the Eye with a Sharp Stick, which is a British colloquialism, as in, well, it's better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. And John decided to call it that, and we all liked that show, and it was really, just known as Poke in the Eye. When it came to the title for the film, Roger Grafe, who was the wonderful documentary maker who captured this show and all the behind the scenes and rehearsals, came up with a different title. The show was taking place at Her Majesty's Theatre, and there's a colloquial expression in Britain when somebody is in prison. Technically, the formal term is it for somebody being in prison is that person is detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. As though the Queen knows every individual convict. But that's the phrase, you are detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. And so a play on words, since everyone was having good fun and it was to do with prisoners, Roger came up with the title Pleasure at Her Majesty's. So that's how the film of the A Poke in the Eye show became known. And the record album that we put out was, however, called A Poke in the Eye. And you're wondering, how did it become part of the Secret Policeman's Ball? Well, that really unfolds later, but this was the very first show for Amnesty International. And after this show in 1976, there was a desire to do more. There was another show in 1977 that took place, a smaller show just over one night, called The Mermaid Frolics. And then in 1979, and we'll talk about this more during the Secret Policeman's Ball commentary, we came up with the new show, and that was titled Secret Policeman's Ball, and we'll explain all that during that commentary. But looking back, Amnesty looked at those first two shows, and particularly this show, A Poke in the Eye, as being the antecedents to Secret Policeman's Ball. Without this show and the 1977 show, there would never have been a Secret Policeman's Ball. So Amnesty retrospectively looked back on it and said, you know what, this is part of the Secret Policeman's Ball canon. And in fact, when Amnesty first started gathering up their various collections in Britain, I think it was in 2004, for the 25th anniversary of the Secret Policeman's Ball, Amnesty put together a wonderful box set for that time, where they included Pleasure to Majestys for the first time as part of the Secret Policeman's Ball canon, Secret Policeman's Ball series. So it's now regarded as part of it, quite rightly. Now, I guess some of the people in the front row in particular were relieved that Barry wasn't doing his full performance from his stage show, because in his stage show, Barry, as Dame Edna, would go into the audience and extract painfully funny personal information. You would find yourself divulging what your bedroom looked like, what your bathroom looked like, and Barry Humphries has the most brilliant memory, and so he would go through the stage, through a 3-hour show, chat to people in the audience, remember vivid details, and 2 hours later he'd come back to them and embarrass them and said, "Oh, I remember about your bathroom." So the audience were happy it was just a song at that point, I think. I got to work with Barry first in 1973 on a comedy album, and this was also him having fun at the expense of the English in his Australian character role, and he was then and remains just one of the funniest people. And it's so funny also to see him off character, because off stage he's very quiet and can be funny, but he's not the extrovert that he is when he's in Dame Edna outfit. I have sometimes seen him sitting wearing a regular suit dressed as Barry and start putting on an Edna voice, and that is too surreal. Now Barry, Dame Edna, is going to do the traditional thing of sharing the gladioles with the audience. So there's one going up there, quite a good throw, right up into the highest part of the orchestra, the dress circle, I think we used to call that in England. Dame Edna takes her curtsy, and an unbelievable thing. Now, you will see two of the leading lights of that early boom in Britain of comedy in the early 60s. John Fortune I've mentioned on the right, and the lady on the left is Eleanor Bron. Now, if you're a Beatles fan, you might remember in the movie Help, that is the gorgeous lady in Help. And Eleanor Bron was also she was a good friend of Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, and she was Dudley Moore's love interest in the great film Bedazzled. I'm talking about the original film Bedazzled, directed by Stanley Donen, not the remake. And Eleanor Bron and John Fortune, they had a kind of Mike Nichols and Elaine May relationship in terms of comedy performing. They were a great duo doing humour about the relationship, the vexed stresses between men and women, and they were quite known for it. So that was like a little quickie performance. Now, elements. Now, Peter Cook is going to do one of the classic moments. This was one of the pieces that when they were talking about this in rehearsals, they were looking forward to. Peter Cook as a miner, ruining the fact that he had never become a judge. This was a famous routine, not just from Beyond the Fringe, but from Peter Cook's solo work, and delivered in his trademark monotone for this character. A character who actually had the name of... He once was asked, people always ask him why he didn't do more. I mean, he had such a huge success in his relationship with Dudley Moore. They did, as well as the film Bedazzled, they did a show on Broadway called Good Evening that was a huge hit in the early 70s. They did the infamous Derek and Clive recordings, a set of 3 different albums and 1 film. that was released on home video. And then, of course, Dudley Moore became very successful as a big star in America and as a movie star in films such as Foul Play and 10 and Arthur. Peter preferred to live in England. He had a couple of efforts at working in America. He was on a sitcom in America, in LA in 1982, I recall. But Peter tended to prefer living in England. And when some people said, well, you know, aren't you jealous of Dudley's success? I remember I had this conversation with Peter once. I said, come on, Peter, you know, this was at the time of Arthur being reach hit. Come on, Peter, aren't you just a little bit jealous of all that fame of Dudley? And I remember Peter saying, Martin, there's two kinds of fame. There's fame like Dudley, and there's fame like Charles Manson. There has to be something between the two. And this was just the affectionate dig that, typical of the affectionate digs that Peter and Dudley would make at each other. Dudley used to tease Peter as well, but they really were, this is really the pièce de résistance in a way. This is the famous Monty Python court sketch. And so it's the first time the audience is seeing pretty much the entirety of Monty Python, with the one exception of Eric Idle, who, as I say, was sadly away and was not in town at the time, so Peter substituted for him. And in this little piece, one of the things that I think has always been the case with Monty Python, and sometimes mystified the Pythons themselves, was that sometimes there was reference humour. They would mention names in this little piece where there's a list of all the people who've been murdered, but the judge is reading out. Some of the names are funny really only to a British audience because they're cultural references, and yet American audiences laugh, and the Pythons have been somewhat mystified by it. But the reality is the delivery, even if you don't know who some of these names, the last one he says, and Nicholas Parsons. Nicholas Parsons was like the equivalent of the most Nicholas Parsons was the equivalent of a game show host that everybody might laugh at in America, like the host of Wheel of Fortune or something like that. And it just got a laugh. He threw in the name. No one here would know Nicholas Parsons, but to an English audience. But, you know, the cadence of it, just where it comes, it's funny anyway. Peter now enjoying himself as an honorary Python, and the skit is quite priceless.
He is not here yet, Malone.
Now notice that there was not a full attempt to dress up. I mean, though Michael Palin is portraying a solicitor, a lawyer, or in Britain called a barrister, he is still wearing his lumberjack shirt in anticipation of doing that later. He wouldn't normally do that. Obviously in a TV show or film he'd be fully dressed, but it was a kind of informal thing, and I think the audience accepted it, and certainly Michael did. Now this is possibly one of the best routines. I mean, one of perhaps people's favourites is between Cleese and Cook during the cross-examination. Cleese, of course, was training as a lawyer at one point, so he used to love doing courtroom sketches and used to playing lawyers. This cross-examination, you might remember in his film A Fish Called Wanda, John plays a barrister. A barrister, by the way, is the lawyer who goes into court. Now, this classic routine, look at Cleese's eyes.
Please wheedle this out of your nostrils!
And interesting, coming up here, a rare expletive.
I realize you're meant to be the counsel for the defense.
Rare expletive from John.
Sorry, everyone. Shit, what a goofy.
John tended to veer away from bad language, or use it very, very sparingly. He used it in the cheese shop sketch. And actually, this was one of the hallmarks of Monty Python's humour. If you actually watch through, obviously in the TV shows they couldn't use certain bad language, but they could in their films, but they use it very sparingly. So if you have a four-letter word, you don't get it littered throughout the skit. It would always be used just once or twice for the most powerful emphasis. Now, this cross-examination of the coffin, or what might be in the coffin, and there's a later moment backstage where they're having a conversation about it, and Peter Cook volunteers a suggestion. Again, a part of the cross-fertilisation. Peter Cook comes up with an idea for how they might do it differently the next night. The filming was done over all 3 nights, and Roger Grafe, the very talented documentary maker, who, by the way, was known in Britain primarily for doing fly-on-the-wall verite documentaries, usually about serious matters, for example, British politics, trade unions, state-run industries. That was Roger's speciality, which is why he was so good at all that fly-on-the-wall stuff in the dressing rooms and rehearsals. So he captured all of this, and Roger set up his crew, a 60mm crew, and filmed all 3 nights. By the way, I believe, if memory serves, there was only a 3-camera crew, which was very, very small for capturing a show, but there was a very small budget. I mean, this first show was done literally on a shoestring. We were begging favours wherever we could. The mobile truck we got for this first show, I think it was the Virgin. Was it Virgin's Mobile or Islands Mobile? I forget which record company. Went to one of the studios and begged a mobile truck. And this was the great thing. Though Amnesty was not that well known, obviously it was a good cause, human rights. And the fact that Monty Python and Peter Cook and Beyond the Fringe and all these folks were doing the show for free meant that you could go to these people and say, look, these guys are doing it for free. Will you lend a hand? Will you help out and provide your facilities? And I remember that whichever of the mobile trucks it was, the mobile truck provided their services free. The engineers chipped in. Everybody wanted to be part of it. And, you know, if there was a hard expense, you know, something you had to buy or rent, especially for the event, obviously that would be paid for. But everything else was pretty much done on favours and goodwill, of which there was considerable. So, you know, I look at this and we know that, you know, if there was an 8-camera crew of Martin Scorsese with state-of-the-art 35mm cameras, you know, maybe it would look slightly different. But in 1976, with just 3 cameras, Roger Grafe and his crew did an unbelievable job. And if memory serves, the editor was a fabulous guy called Tom Schwarm, I think passed on a couple of years ago. And Tom did an excellent job in editing, particularly given how finite the amount of footage he was working with, and also the limited lighting. When you understand that we gained access to the theatre at 10:30 at night and had to start the show at 11:30 at night, and there was a show in there, a regular play, there wasn't time to specially light it. There was very, very primitive, what we would call available lighting. They were lighting for the stage show, for the audience in the theatre, not lighting for film. If you were shooting this for film or as a concert special, you know, you would spend hours and hours, days and days getting the lighting perfect. Here everything is flying by the seat of the pants, but the essence of it is in the performance, so we're forgiving, I think, as an audience of such imperfections as there are.
On the map.
Now, Michael Palin's getting off into one of his wonderful perorations as a barrister. The British always like mocking the pomposity of the British legal system, and this plays a part in the Secret Policeman's Ball story, because in the 1979 film, as you'll see, Peter Cook does a very memorable appearance as a judge, the role that Terry Jones is playing. By the way, of course, in the British legal system, such as the British male's fascination for dressing up, there's always a wig. So yes, the judges wear a wig, and the barristers have to wear wigs. Don't ask, I've no idea why. I'm sure it's just something to do with the British pleasure at cross-dressing. I'm not sure. Otherwise, what could it possibly explain it? But no, it's part of the tradition, and they still, to this day, judges wear wigs, and barristers in court wear wigs. Now, Peter Cook was improvising a little bit here. It was not quite on the script, but the Pythons took it in good shape.
Which is in itself
Shut up!
the whole moral structure of
Yes.
capitalism.
If you don't
which
shut
led
up,
to the Vietnam War,
I'll shoot
and
you.
other such, just as I thought, you see. This example of force.
It was
But I really must...
not really expected that people would shoot each other on stage in a show. Suitable thing. Now, a skating vicar is ordered in by the judge. He's ordering in various things, and a skating vicar will come in the shape of Neil Innes. Those of you who are Monty Python fans or fans of the Ruttles will know Neil Innes. He was an associate Python who provided the music for films and stage shows, and here and there, that's Neil Innes as the skating vicar. And Neil, of course, has a role in this film as a solo performer, but as a member of the Python troupe, very happy to perform as a roller skating vicar. And here they are doing that little routine that they rehearsed in which we saw earlier on. And they've got the they have the Terpsichorean muse down to perfection. Now, John Cleese preparing to be the Pope. There you are, see him in his pontiff outfit. Just bending down, getting that on. See how cramped. They're all literally, I think, in 3 dressing rooms. And in between the shows, they're discussing. Here's John Fortune, we just saw him with Eleanor Bron on the left, and John Bird, wonderful performer who is going to do this. This is a lovely piece they used to do, I believe, at the Establishment Club in the early 60s, a spoof on auditions. And one famous song.
Potatoes, and you say potatoes.
Now, John Fortune and John Bird have formed, they were always friends and performed occasionally together. In the late 90s, they teamed up on a British TV show with a character called Rory Bremner. And they are now kind of colloquially known as the Two Johns, and have become very, very popular. Again, they'd had some leaner years in the sort of in the late 70s, early 80s, where they weren't so much in vogue, newer, younger comedians coming up. But since the mid to late 90s, they have been really revered as elder statesmen of British comedy. John Bird was noted, as I mentioned earlier, for his portrayal of Idi Amin, was quite a huge success in Britain at that time, and was also noted for doing impressions of various British Prime Ministers, and was always spot on.
Look, I'm sorry.
Now, I mentioned that Neil Innes had a role in the show. Now, Cleese, by the way, of course, now Cleese is getting even more into his ecclesiastical gear. The difference, notice Michael Palin quite happy to appear as a barrister wearing a lumberjack shirt, but John is going to be making an appearance as the Pope. And when you're going to be appearing as the Pope, you've got to be properly dressed. There's no, you couldn't get away with a lumberjack shirt and still command attention as the Pope. By the way, the sketch that we're going to be seeing from Cleese was something that was written originally for Monty Python, and the BBC thought it was too strong. Here's Peter Cook. Now, I mentioned this earlier, Peter Cook coming up with an idea for the courtroom sketch about maybe a way to play it slightly differently, and if memory serves, they did try this out the next night. Now, this is Neil Innes. We just saw him a few moments ago as a skating vicar. Neil Innes, among the many wonderful creations he came up with, was a spoof on protest singers. Not just Bob Dylan, but protest singers in general. And in fact, this character is known by some Monty Python fans by the name that Eric Idle used to introduce Neil, I believe at City Centre in New York, and it was enshrined on a record where he introduced him as Raymond Scum. That had become the name for some Monty Python fans, but for Neil it was always just the protest singer. Now, this is about a year before The Ruttles makes its appearance. Neil, of course, is the man who wrote all the songs for The Ruttles, and he created The Ruttles with Eric Idle. They were friends together and were appearing at this time in the mid-70s in a TV show that Eric did called Rutland Weekend Television. And this song actually appears in that Rutland Weekend Television. Rutland Weekend Television was the TV show that first saw the Ruttles skit. I guess it's the equivalent, say, of the way that Wayne's World became a success. Remember, Wayne's World, of course, was born on Saturday Night Live as just a little 3-minute skit, and then developed and became eventually a movie. the Rutles was formed the same way. It was just like a little 3-minute, 4-minute skit on Rutland Weekend Television. And very famously, Eric Idle hosted, I think it was in the first season of Saturday Night Live, either the first or second season of Saturday Night Live, and he brought with him a clip of the Rutles, played it, and everyone went crazy. Lorne Michaels thought it was brilliant, audience reaction was great, and Lorne Michaels encouraged Eric to come up with a full-length film, which is how the Rutles' All You Need Is Cash was born. And Eric, of course, worked with Neil Innes. Neil went away and wrote all the songs, and Neil became the Ron Nasty character, the John Lennon character, and Eric became Dirk McQuickley, the Paul McCartney character. But so this is a very rich period, and the relationship between Neil and the Pythons. Neil, of course, had also written several of the songs for the Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So Neil had been actually one of the key performers in a band called the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, later called just the Bonzo Dog Band, who had quite a cult following in America, and their one big hit record was actually produced by Paul McCartney. So Neil Innes, especially in England in 1976, had a really big following, and this Dylan spoof was very, very cherished. And in fact, Neil and I went back into the studio, going to say it was 1980. It was around the time that Bob Dylan was coming to England for a concert tour, his first concert tour in England for many years, and Neil said, why don't we put out Protest Song as a single? So Amnesty gave their blessing, and we went in and remixed it, and it came out and did quite well, and Neil had a lot of fun with it. Now, this skit is precious. This is a friend of John Cleese called Jonathan Lynn. He'd been at Cambridge University, and he was primarily known as a director. You may have seen films that he did, such as Nuns on the Run. He also did the movie Clue. But he was an actor before he became a director, and John asked him to be with him in this particular skit. This was a skit in which John had written for Monty Python, but the BBC thought it was a little bit too risque, so they didn't actually include it in the show ever. And John loved the skit very much and wanted to do it live on stage. By the way, you see that telephone there. This is not because they expect that Michelangelo and the Pope back in the 15th or 16th century had a telephone. That telephone is there from another skit in which Alan Bennett will be coming on and using a telephone in a few minutes' time, and there was so little time that they had to put their props in the side of the stage, or sometimes they were actually on stage, so that was a mistake that it was there. But we've always wondered, some people have wondered why it was there in that moment. So this skit was considered by the BBC a little bit too risque, so they said, no, you can't do it in Monty Python. So John said, well, listen, this is something that I want to do on stage. So this is an example of something that the audience wouldn't necessarily been so familiar with. And in fact, probably for a lot of the audience, unless they'd been lucky enough to see this in one of the Python's stage shows, and I think they only did it quite rarely at that time, this would have been something brand new they're seeing. And John Cleese, in full regalia as the Pope, was a sight to behold. And this became one of the hallmark shows. And in fact, when we were doing the album jacket for the cast album of the show, A Poke in the Eye with a Sharp Stick, I asked for help from Terry Gilliam, and Terry came up with a design for the front cover. But he said, look, here's the basic graphic visual, but you'll have to use all the photos. You just need to drop in photos around it. And we were looking for photos of John to use, and the shot that everybody loved the most was John as the Pope pointing. There's something, I think it's just perhaps you don't often see an angry Pope pointing, but it was such an iconic moment. And in fact, now the memory's just coming back to me. When we had a premiere of this in a theatrical situation at the London Film Festival in November of 1976, even before this film was shown on television. We had a theatrical screening, and I've just remembered that the invitation we created for that screening had this picture of John as the Pope pointing, and where it said a poke in the eye, it looked like John's finger. That's the picture, it's that image there. It looked like the poke in the eye was coming from John's finger as the Pope. I'll have to tell you in a few moments about that screening, because that theatrical screening, there it is, that theatrical screening of this film was what led to The Secret Policeman's Ball being released as a theatrical film as opposed to just being on television. Now again, backstage preparing to go on stage as the Goodies. They have not performed live before on stage, and they're a little bit nervous about doing so. But this record has been a big hit in England, as I say. It was a kind of novelty song, and a different level of humour. It was aimed more at a kind of younger crowd. Here's Jonathan Miller going over the cast and over the actual running order, and at certain times they're realising the show is overrunning at this point. By now we're looking at it's going to be like 3.5 hours, and they're wondering if they can cut certain skits. I remember this moment quite vividly. Now the Goodies get out there and perform, and though the Goodies don't have the same cherished reputation in Britain as the Pythons, there's a good-natured attitude about them. People know that they are not as sophisticated as the Pythons, but they're happy to goof off and have a bit of fun. As you see, they're not quite so slickly choreographed, but they're having fun with it. This song, Funky Gibbon, was, I think it was actually, if not number one, it was certainly a top 5 hit at that time. The Goodies TV show was very much full of slapstick. I guess it was closest, it was something like a cross between a Junior Python and the Three Stooges, and they just played 3 guys who all lived in the same house and did funny things together. Kind of, you know what, with a touch of the Monkees thrown in. Three Stooges meets the Monkees, British style. Now, this music, this song and the Neil Innes song, Protest Song, really the only two, and Dame Edna, they're the only music you see in this film. And that was because in 1976, for that show, we had not yet come up with the idea of using serious music. It was a comedy show, so if there was music, it was comedic music. It wasn't till 79, with The Secret Policeman's Ball, that the idea came up of putting in some serious music as a kind of counterpoint to the comedy, interludes between all the comedy, if you will. Now, a little audience participation sought from Bill Loddy. Now, as I mentioned to you, Tim Brooke-Taylor, the chap in the centre, did appear with John Cleese, Graham Chapman, and also with John Cleese, Graham Chapman, and Marty Feldman. He was the 4th member of the quartet in this programme called At Last 1948 Show. One of the 2 progenitors, there's another progenitor of the Monty Python called Do Not Adjust Your Set, which featured Michael Palin, Terry Jones, Terry Gilliam, and Eric Idle. And also it had the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes. So these are the little bits of the jigsaw puzzle, if you like, that help you understand how Monty Python came into being. And these 2 TV shows were going at the same time, one on one channel and both in 67, 68. They're on 2 different channels, and it was somebody at the BBC who had the idea of gathering these folks together and seeing if they could work, taking the best members of each show and seeing if they would work as an ensemble. And now we come to another famous routine. This is Alan Bennett sending a telegram. Now, I realise that for those of you not as ancient as me, which is probably everybody, I'm pretty old, a telegram, I don't even think telegrams exist anymore. But in those long, far-off days before texting and email and various and iChat and instant messaging, if you wanted to send a written greeting to somebody a little bit faster than the snail mail of mail or post, you would send a telegram. And the way you would send a telegram was, yes, you would pick up a telephone, dictate it over the phone to somebody. The charge would go onto your telephone bill, and this little bit of paper with the words written actually stuck down like it was part of a ransom note would be delivered a few hours later to somebody's house. I know this sounds very archaic, and that's because it was. So some of this humour, I guess, might seem a little bit weird. Why would somebody be dictating a message? But you know, we can't change time. That was what it was like in 1976. Alan Bennett was also the master of the most beautifully turned phrases. There's a moment here where he's having a conversation. He's trying to just simply do a matter-of-fact business of dictating a telegram, but the rather chatty telegram lady gets into too much personal detail, and Alan Bennett utters the most brilliant line. It's pure Alan Bennett. He just says, "We seem to be drifting into a somewhat redundant intimacy." This is the love of wordcraft that people especially revere in Alan Bennett, and it's a hallmark of the humour that came from the comedians who first came to prominence in the late 50s, early 60s. By the way, you will sometimes hear the term Oxbridge. Oxbridge is a portmanteau of the two words Oxford and Cambridge, and this was just the terminology used to describe any people, not just performers, people who emerged from either Oxford or Cambridge, those two Ivy League universities, the British equivalent of Harvard or Yale or Princeton. So if you hear that term Oxbridge, it means, oh, they came from Oxford or Cambridge. And pretty much all the comedic performers, because they're not really comedians, they're more actors and comedic humorists, these performers came to light in the late 50s, early 60s. They'd been to Oxford or Cambridge University, and that was very, very much the trait through that period. Even as late, Rowan Atkinson was from, I believe, from Oxford University, and it was just a tradition that the people would go to Oxford, normally to study some other matter. They might be studying history or philosophy, but they would do these amateur dramatics. In Cambridge, it was called the Footlight Society. They would just do these fun shows, and it was from these shows that Monty Python, Beyond the Fringe, and all these other great performers came. They would just do it. They were amateurs. Jonathan Miller was training to be a doctor. In fact, qualified and became a doctor. They were all studying other things, but they found their métier in these amateur performances that were so cherished by audiences that they ended up taking a comedic turn. They were, if you like, the hothouses. They were the equivalent of all the comedy clubs we had in America in the 80s, and all the comedic talent in Britain in the 60s and 70s was coming out of the universities. By the way, that changed in Britain in the early 80s. Then there was a new wave of comedians who were coming out. Usually a lot of them were working class comedians, or they were coming out of a different environment, and not so, their humour was not necessarily coming from that more sophisticated, word-based, cerebral humour. A lot more earthy humour emerged in the mid to late 80s. And we'll see that in The Secret Policeman's Third Ball and Secret Policeman's Biggest Ball, which featured some of those newer performers who at that time were referred to as alternative comedians. But these were the top people. Now, see that date, April 1st, 1976. Gosh, how perfect. They were actually reading a paper. They're going to use that paper as a prop, I suspect. But there it was actually using, they were using that paper. That was that day's paper. I'm glad it's there. And yes, it was that first night. This is a friend of John Cleese, who's a mime artist called Des Jones, who was completely new to the audiences. It was not particularly well known, but had a very striking impact. Now, I'd mentioned to you that Roger Grave, who was really well known in Britain at that time as a documentary maker, had agreed to make this film of the show, and he planned to put it on British television, and he'd got a slot lined up for Christmas week, which was a really excellent slot on BBC television. And as he was going on with the editing, I remember chatting with Peter Luff about an idea I had, which was there was a film festival in London, always held in November at that time, called the London Film Festival. And I thought maybe it would be interesting to get some exposure, some publicity, because we were about to release the comedy album. And I thought maybe we'd get some bit of publicity if we could get a screening of the film there. Roger was very happy to have that done. The film festival was run by a guy called Ken Walashin, who later became the head of the AFI, the American Film Institute. But at that time, Ken was running the London Film Festival. He agreed to put the film on, and we showed it at the National Film Theatre on the south bank of London, near the River Thames, and it was in the middle of November. And when we showed the film, we didn't know what to expect, because we thought maybe the audience won't like seeing a stage show with a theatre audience laughing. Bear in mind, this is 3 years before Richard Pryor Live in Concert, which was a big hit, but up till then there had been no success, certainly in Britain, with any films of live comedy. But we decided to have a go at it, and we showed it, and there was an amazing audience reaction. And much to our joy, we found that most of the audience were just going crazy in the movie theatre. And that was a big influence on us in later years when it came to The Secret Policeman's Ball, because we realised that, yes, if we made a film, it didn't have to be just for TV, it could also be shown in movie screens. And that was a big, big part of The Secret Policeman's Ball, how that developed and reached a bigger audience. So it's thanks to Ken Wolashin going on for what is going to be a very physical sketch with a lot of slapstick. So you can see a lot of padding is going on, and for good reason, as you'll see in this sketch. Terry Jones, now the British, of course, play sports like rugby and don't have any padding like American football. But for this sketch, even the bravest Brit has to have a bit of padding on. This was known, had two different names. It was sometimes known as the Japes Lecture, because it's a spoof on a university professor trying to do this very serious analysis of comedy and slapstick humour. And sometimes it was known as Custard Pie for reasons that will become known a little later. Now, again, you will see Terry Gilliam. He's just slightly obscured there at the back. There's Michael Palin with his leg out, and Terry Gilliam there. Again, I mentioned Terry Gilliam, much more a performer in the stage shows than in the films. Usually when they were filming the TV shows, or Terry Gilliam would be very busy making the animations, so he couldn't be around for the filming. He did a few little cameo roles. Now there is the delightful Carol Cleveland. Carol Cleveland was the main Python girl, as they used to call her. The Pythons, of course, were very fond of dressing up as ladies and played so many memorable female characters, but they knew they needed some real feminine beauty, and Carol Cleveland was their absolute favourite. You'll also see in the Monty Python TV episodes a few appearances by Connie Booth, who at the time was John Cleese's wife and later appeared with him in Fawlty Towers. Connie Booth was actually the co-writer of Fawlty Towers, and one of the bonuses on this disc is a skit from the second Amnesty show, The Mermaid Frolics, with John Cleese and Connie Booth acting together, Rarity Rarity. By the time, I remember this is quite late at night, and Jonathan Miller's probably looking a little worried by the fact that we're running so late. But having said that, running late, but the audience reaction by now is so, everybody's happy. It doesn't matter that it's running late. Some of the audience isn't quite sure where these custard pies are going to land. I'm certain those in the front row were a little bit of trepidation. This routine became very, very famous. By the way, Michael Palin is not supposed to get a custard pie on him. The only person who's supposed to get a custard pie on him is Terry Jones. And through this sketch, you will see that Terry Jones in the centre there is the prime recipient of custard pies. I think it's shaving foam, if memory serves. But you will see in this skit, accidentally, Michael Palin gets a bit of custard pie on him, and afterwards there's a little bit in the dressing room where Michael explains why he forgot to duck at a crucial moment and received a custard pie. Terry Jones was always very good about being the butt of the joke, so he had to be.
And finally, the foul pie.
This was one of those skits in which Terry always got it. Now, bringing on the pies is Bill Oddie from the Goodies. I think he was Carol Cleveland having brought the first batch on. He gets a cheer. Everybody knows Bill Oddie from the Goodies. And a lovely little moment here.
I wish I were doing it.
And Terry is pieless. But I think you will see that Michael Palin gets a little bit more on him than is bargained for. That was not supposed to happen, and in the dressing room afterwards, Michael being very stoic about having that pie in the face, but afterwards you will hear him discuss how that happened.
But finally,
And now a classic Monty Python twist. We all think we know what's coming, but the Pythons always have a twist.
Education be derived from the simple, straightforward, sideways, completely unexpected deposit.
Yep. Pythons having fun with it. And here they are, a little quick post-mortem on what happened. How come there was this pie in the face?
They didn't build quite as nice, but they were, like, Chow was really getting lots of laughs out of the pie sticking to his head.
Yeah. I think so.
Get hurt?
Oh, no, actually didn't hurt, actually.
Didn't hurt tonight.
I usually don't get hit when you do the sideways one. I usually avoid it. I was miles away in Cloud Cuckoo Land thinking, oh, somebody up there.
There's that moment that I mentioned. That camaraderie with everybody in the backstage. Oh, those photos, Peter Cook had that little, that's a Polaroid camera, very Imagine new at that time, I think. Now, this is a classic moment. This is the delightful Eleanor Bron. We saw her earlier just doing a little thing with John Fortune, and I mentioned that she was in a double act with John Fortune, a kind of Elaine May character to British audiences, and of course very memorably in the films Help and Bedazzled. Here she is doing a spoof written specially for her by the great British playwright Michael Frayn, playwright and humorist. Michael Frayn did Noises Off and so many other stage shows. Michael Frayn wrote this piece specially for her, and it's called Appeal. And when you watch this and listen to it, it's a great insight into why this particular show and the subsequent shows, The Secret Policeman's Ball, was so different at that time. In 1976, benefit shows, as I mentioned, were rarely held, and they were always middle of the road. They were usually in rickety church halls or in polite theatre audiences, and it were always there was always something rather worthy, as though people weren't enjoying the show, but they were there for a good cause. It was like wearing your conscience on your face. It was a good deed. It was, you didn't actually enjoy it, you did it because it was worthy and you had to do it.
Small pieces of decayed fish paste with knitting needles.
So Michael Frayn wrote this brilliant piece for Eleanor Bron, which satirised that. And what she's doing, and why the audience is enjoying it so much, is because they know that this is precisely the kind of speech that was normally given at benefit events. And of course this benefit event, the poke in the eye with the sharp stick, was so radically different. So the audience is getting a special pleasure. It's like being at a concert with the Rolling Stones and suddenly coming on and doing a Wayne Newton thing. You can absolutely see this is a huge generational difference. She's satirising the previous generation's way of having benefit shows.
Wouldn't be allowed to pass without mention of Mrs. Hussey and her loyal support on the teapot.
Eleanor Bron appeared in later Amnesty shows, including The Secret Policeman's Ball, and it was very much the case in the 60s and 70s that it was rare to see comedic performers. That would change a little bit in Britain in the 80s. French and Saunders, the duo that came up with Absolutely Fabulous, and they also had a show called Girls on Top on British television. They started to make more headway, but it was very much a boys' club in the 60s and 70s, and you had to be a really tough and exceptional performer to break through. Eleanor Bron is one of the few female performers from the 60s and 70s who really had a breakthrough, and very cherished and revered by her peers, which is why John Fortune and Peter Cook were always so happy to work with her.
Young faces here tonight. We often think that young people today are only out for a good time. Well, that certainly can't be said of these young people. It's also very gratifying to see all these other people who are not quite so young. I know how tempting it is, believe me, just to sit in front of a good fire and watch your favourite television programme. And there are one or two rather good programmes on tonight. I know how tempting it is to think, oh, let someone else go out this time and get themselves entertained.
After the success of this show in 1976, the following year there was another show put on called The Mermaid Frolics, and it was a single night show on a Sunday evening, in the early evening actually, pretty much in that sense rather like a traditional benefit show. There wasn't time to put on a late night show. John Cleese was able to perform, but he wasn't available to round up so many of his friends. It was still very enjoyable, and it had Peter Cook, it had John Cleese and Connie Booth, it had Peter Ustinov, it was directed by Terry Jones, and it was a stepping stone to The Secret Policeman's Ball. It didn't have such a big impact. It yielded not a film, but a 60-minute TV special and a comedy album. But what it did do was it kept the pot boiling. Now, in 1978, alas, Peter Luff and David Simpson left Amnesty International, and there were new folks who joined to take their place. But it was a shame, because Peter Luff was undoubtedly a major driving force of those first two shows, and without Peter Luff's groundwork there would have been nothing for us to build on, and that was so crucial, and Peter Luff deserves a huge amount of respect for his pioneering work on those first two shows. Now we come to a moment that a lot of the older folks in the audience were reliving, and some of the younger ones were seeing for the first time, certainly on stage, the classic Shakespeare skit from Beyond the Fringe.
And for war! And so we bid you welcome.
This piece was always one of the most popular pieces in the Beyond the Fringe show. A lot of the Beyond the Fringe show consisted of some solo and two-handers, but when they were on stage, all four together was always the most popular. And this was such a classic moment, because what they were doing was they were parodying and making fun of this reverence in Britain for Shakespeare. You know, all of us who grew up in England in the 40s, 50s, early 60s, we were having Shakespeare rammed down our throats in ways that we didn't necessarily enjoy it. So it took Beyond the Fringe to make fun of it. They took all the language, all the over melodramatic gestures, because we were raised to have great respect for Laurence Olivier or John Gielgud or Ralph Richardson whenever they were doing Shakespeare. And it was, I've got to tell you, in 1959, 1960, it was considered quite impish. It was cheeky to make fun of Britain's most revered playwright and the most revered actors. But the Beyond the Fringes did it with wit and affection. It wasn't just saying, oh, Shakespeare is rubbish or anything silly like that. They were just taking the excesses. And in fact, this was less a parody of Shakespeare and more a pastiche of over melodramatic performances of Shakespeare, which was very much the norm. Now, this is Terry Jones doing the part that in the original was played by Dudley Moore. Alan Bennett having such a good time with this. Terry Jones absolutely in his element.
Wise words in mouths of...
Because Beyond the Fringe was done in such an early time, I think it was on the West End stage in 1961 and on Broadway in 1962, there was only a very poor kinescope recording of the show. It wasn't ever filmed with a big film crew or big video crew. There's just literally a very primitive there's just a very primitive film record of it. So by 1976, Beyond the Fringe was something hallowed in people's memories. Oh, did you ever see Beyond the Fringe? And if you were, like a lot of the audience, younger, too young to have gone to the West End Theatre in 1961, you knew of Beyond the Fringe. People would recite the skits because they were on a record album. There was no video, home video in 1976, so you didn't actually get to see it. This was rare, and it's hard for us in this day and age because in this YouTube era, everything's available on video, everything's available on a click of a mouse. But in 1976, seeing this skit was seeing something you'd heard about and maybe heard on a record, but you'd never seen it on stage unless you were one of the older crowd who'd been there originally. Now the famous fencing routine, and interestingly, you might remember in the rehearsal for this on the stage, when Jonathan Miller, who used to say, oh, look, I'm not really a performer, I'm a director. Some of you might remember that he did wonderful television series. I think it was about health, that was shown here on PBS, because he's a doctor, he's a sculptor, he's a director. Was always saying in the press how much he hated performing, hate performing. Performing wasn't what his thing. He was a director, he was a serious fellow. But of course, when he performs, he is quite charismatic, and that's why in the rehearsals, when he's feigning death, Peter Cook keeps going ham, 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 because Jonathan, for somebody who says he's not a performer, does do a magnificent job of it. This is the bit that Peter, look at that stone face, but one knows what Peter is thinking. And one of the great lines is, of course, it's a play on Worcester sauce, and that people in all the dukes and noble people in England were known by various places. Worcester is a place. So here comes the line.
Oh, saucy Worcester.
Oh, saucy Worcester, dost thou lie so low? A revered line, almost as famous in its day as "I wish to register a complaint." So the audience gives it a little roar. And now this is Jonathan Miller's little moment that comes to fruition. He has come up with the idea that he wants to crossfade the end of this with the beginning of Lumberjack. So you have Shakespeare and Lumberjack. A great idea, never occurred to anyone before. Jonathan Miller comes up with it. And the audience knows that this has to be a grand finale. How could it not be? It was 3 o'clock in the morning, if not 3:30 by the time. And out come all those lumberjacks, not all of them in full sync, knowing the words, as you'll see, some of them trying to work it out as they go along. To be a lumberjack, apart from the Pythons who obviously did know it, the lumberjacks at the back was anybody who could get into a lumberjack costume. We had a bunch of them delivered backstage, and everybody grabbed them and made their way forward. Now, the only accompaniment was Neil Innes on the piano, and that comes up when there is a reprise of it, because it was very clear they hadn't actually rehearsed the reprise, and there's a little bit of misunderstanding, but they cover for it well and manage to bring the song to a grand conclusion, even though there's been no, they're clearly off the reservation when it comes to the sequence of the song. Now, you're also going to see another one of those Jonathan Miller moments where he suggested that they wander off as though they've been attending a seminar on lumberjacks. By the way, this was one of the things, this particular song was what got George Harrison of the Beatles so excited about Monty Python. He liked this song so much, he volunteered to produce a version of it, and there was a single of Lumberjack Song produced by George Harrison. Quite a magnificent version. And that led to his friendship, of course, and financed Monty Python's Life of Brian when the original backers pulled out. Now you'll see here they decide after they're taking their bow, the credits will run, they'll take their bow, the piano strikes up and they decide, well, they'll go into a bit of a reprise, but not everybody is quite prepared for it. That first night, I know it was getting towards 4 o'clock before we were finished that first night. Some of the skits were cut from the second and third night. Those shows were definitely shorter, and the filming was definitely done on all 3 nights. There's look at that. Oh, she's got to have. The audience didn't want to let anyone go, even though they'd already had such a magnificent show that lasted so long. The audience wanted more, and with good reason. See, somebody's got the edited by Tom Schwarm. Tom deserves great credit for what he did with that material. His Roger Gross credit. And here we come into the little reprise, and you'll see it doesn't quite go where they think it will go.
Down trees, I eat my lunch, I go to the laboratory. On Wednesdays I go shopping and have buttery scones for...
Now, much confusion amongst the lumberjacks will come up, but they will remember Jonathan Miller's recommendation of how to end it.
Sweet old I hate with all
Oops. Eh? What's happened here? Yes, they know. They realise something's happened. Not in the lyrics. Good recovery by Michael Palin. And that was the spirit of these shows. That was typical of a poke in the eye. They just decided to go even beyond that and let's strip off and so on. So that concludes Pleasure and Majesties. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed reliving it and seeing it again. It's the beginning of the Secret Policeman's Ball. After all 3 nights of A Poke in the Eye were completed, everybody involved in the show was absolutely exhausted but exhilarated. We knew we'd put together something really special, and anybody who wasn't there was asking, oh, when can we see this, when can we see this? Well, fortunately, Roger Grayford put together the film, and this was scheduled to air on British television over Christmas of 1976. And around that time, or in the lead up to that, I had an idea. I was friendly with a guy called Ken Walashin, who later became the head of the AFI, the American Film Institute. But back in '76, he was running the London Film Festival. On an instinct, I called him up and asked if it would be possible to show this film to the film festival audience in a big theatre. And Ken agreed to do it, and it had its premiere at the National Film Theatre in London in November of '76. And we discovered something really special. Even though it was a film of an audience watching a show, the audience in the movie theatre laughed just as much. Now, this is 3 years before the Richard Pryor live in concert film, so there was no tradition of that kind of film being shown theatrically. But it taught us a great lesson that people would enjoy what had been put together by the cast in a movie theatre, and that was to come in very important 3 years' time when we came to the Secret Policeman's Ball. Now, we also put together a comedy album that came out, and that was very successful. And in 1977, Peter Luff of Amnesty organised a second show. Now, it wasn't on such a grand scale. It was actually just a single evening at a theatre, and it was called The Mermaid Frolics. It featured John Cleese and his then wife Connie Booth, with whom they co-wrote Fawlty Towers together. It had Peter Cook, it had Peter Ustinov, and it was directed by Terry Jones of Monty Python. Peter and I produced the show, and it did well, but it wasn't such a high-profile event. It had just a one-hour TV special and a comedy album, but it didn't have the same buzz. It wasn't late night, it wasn't 3 nights. So it did a good job of keeping things rolling, but it didn't have the same impact as A Poke in the Eye. But the seeds had been planted. Now, sadly, at the end of 77-78, Peter Luff left Amnesty International, which was a shame because he'd been undoubtedly the driving force